Well, greetings and welcome back to the next episode on the Bond Geek podcast. I am your host, as always, Henry, and I just wanted to say before this episode came out, I have to be absolutely honest, I am very, very nervous about this episode and how it would be potentially received, because I don't think any other person on the James Bond community, whether being audio or visual, has ever done something like this before, and it is actually potentially something new, and I've always wanted to challenge myself and do something like this, which is a full audio narration, like an audiobook of one of Fleming's stories. And so I'm actually quite excited to see how people react to it, what people think about it, and would they like me to do potentially more. I'm very interested in seeing the results of that. A couple little things just to update you on, which has been great. This week coming out, if you are watching this as soon as this episode came out, I'm sure you've heard all the massive worldwide news about Aaron Taylor-Johnson potentially being the next James Bond. Now, I did a little video on this just a bit earlier on the podcast. If I just do a little intro here about it, look, I don't know if it's true or not. I know people have debunked it. Some people say they had to debunk it. There's a lot of people who still believe it. And I just wanted to give quickly here my thoughts again on this situation, because I think it's fair to say. And that is basically this. Look, was Aaron Taylor-Johnson in my top 5 choices to be James Bond? No. I'm going to be honest, absolutely not. Was he in my top 10? No. Was he in my top 15? No. Was he in my top 20? Potentially yes. But you know what? The more I think about it, Aaron Taylor-Johnson is a really good actor, and he's got a wide range of different roles under his belt. And I feel very strongly that if he was to be James Bond, I think it could be a potentially really good choice. But hey, it's all up to the fates here. But again, I think this whole week, at the time of this recording again, has shown that we Bond fans are so eager for some info. I think the whole world is actually eager for some potential Bond 26 info. We'll literally grab anything. So that's really my thoughts about that. There's a lot of other great James Bond stuff coming up, which is really, really cool. So everyone sit back, relax, focus on the road if you're driving, or keep on working at the gym. But right now, let's go into my audiobook, read by me, of The Living Daylights. The Living Daylights by Ian Fleming, read by the Bond Geek. James Bond lay at the 500-yard firing point of the famous Sentry Range at Bisley. The white peg in the grass beside him said 44, and the same number was repeated high up on the distant butt above the single 6-foot square target that to the human eye and in the late summer dusk looked no larger than a postage stamp. But Bond's lens, an infrared sniper scope fixed above his rifle, covered the whole canvas. He could even clearly distinguish the pale blue and beige colours into which the target was divided, and the 6-inch semicircular bull looked as big as the half-moon that was already beginning to show low down in the darkening sky above the distant crest of the Corham Ridges. James Bond's last shot had been an inner left. Not good enough. He took another glance at the yellow and blue wind flags. They were streaming across range from the east rather more swiftly than when he begun his shoot half an hour before, and he set 2 clicks more to the right on the wind gauge and traversed the cross wires on the sniper scope back to point of aim. He then settled himself, put his trigger finger gently inside the guard, and on the curve of the trigger shallowed his breathing and very, very softly squeezed. The vicious crack of the shot boomed across the empty range. The target disappeared below ground, and at once the dummy came up in its place. Yes! The black panel was in the bottom right-hand corner this time, not in the bottom left. A bull. Good, said the voice of the chief range officer from behind and above him. Stay with it. The target was already up again, and Bond put his cheek back to its inner warm patch on the chunky wooden stock, and his eye to the rubber eyepiece of the scope. He wiped his gun hand down the side of his trousers and took the pistol grip that jittered sharply down below the trigger guard. He splayed his legs an inch more. Now they were to be 5 rounds rapid. It would be interesting to see if it would produce fade. He guessed not. The extraordinary weapon the armourer had somehow got his hands on gave one the feeling that a standing man at a mile would be easy meat. It was mostly a .308 caliber International Experimental Target Rifle, built by Winchester to help American marksmen at World Championships, and it had the usual gadgets of super accurate targeted weapons. A curled aluminium hand at the back of the butt that extended under the armpit and held the stock firmly into the shoulder, an adjustable pinion below the rifle's centre of gravity to allow the stock to be nailed into its grooved wooden rest. The armourer had had the usual single-shot bolt action replaced by a 5-shot magazine, and had assured Bond that if he would allow only 2 seconds between shots to steady the weapon, that it would be no fade given at 500 yards. For the job that Bond had to do, he guessed that 2 seconds might be a dangerous loss of time if he missed with his first shot. Anyway, M had said that the range would not be more than 300 yards. Bond would cut it down to 1 second, almost continuous fire. Ready? Yes. I'll give you a countdown from 5. Now, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire! The ground shuddered slightly as the air snagged as the 5 whirling scraps of copper nickel spat off into the dusk. The target went down as quickly, rose again, decorated with 4 small white discs closely grouped on the ball. There was no 5th disc, not even a black one showing an inner or an outer. The last round was low, said the range officer, lowering his night glasses. Thanks for the contribution. We swift the sand of those butts at the end of the year. Never gets less than 15 tons of good lead and copper scrap out of them. Good money. Bond got to his feet. Corporal Menzies from the armourers section appeared from the pavilion of the gun club and knelt down to dismantle the Winchester at its rest. He looked up at Bond. He said with a hint of criticism, "You're taking it a bit fast, sir. Last round was bound to jump wide." "I know, Corporal. I wanted to see how fast I could take it. I'm not blaming the weapon. It's a hell of a fine job. Please tell the armourer so from me. Now, I better get moving. You're finding your own way back to London, aren't you?" "Yes. Good night, sir." The chief range officer handed Bond a record of his shot, 2 sighting shots and then 10 rounds each at 100 yards up to 500. "Damn good firing with this visibility. You ought to come back next year and have a bash at the Queen's Prize. It's open to all commoners nowadays. British Commonwealth, that is." "Thanks. Trouble is, I'm not all that much in England. And thanks for spotting for me." Bond glanced at the distant clock tower on the either side. The red flag and red signal drum were coming down to show the firing had ceased. The hand stood at 9:15. "I'd like to have brought you a drink, but I've got an appointment in London. Can we hold it over until that Queen's Prize you were talking about?" The range officer nodded non-conditionally. He had been looking forward to finding out more about this man who had appeared out of the blue after a flurry of signals from the Ministry of Defence and had then proceeded to score well over 90% on all distances, and that after the range was closed for the night and visibility was poor to bad. And why had he, who only officiated at the annual July meeting, had been ordered to be present? And why had he been told to see that Bond had a 6-inch ball at 500 instead of the regulatory 15-inch? And why, after this flurry with the danger flag and the signal drum that were only used on ceremonial occasions, to put pressure onto the man, to give an edge of urgency to the shot? Bond? Commander James Bond? The NRA would have surely had a record of anyone who could shoot like that. He'd remembered to give him a call. Funny time to have an appointment in London. Probably a girl. The range officer's undistinguished face assumed a disgruntled expression. Sort of fellow who would get on with the girls, like he wanted. The 2 men walked through the handsome facade of Club Row behind the range to Bond's car that stood opposite the bullet-pitted iron reproduction of a Land Caesar famous running deer. "Nice-looking job," commented the range officer. "Never seen a body like that on a Continental. Has it been made specially?" "Yes. The sports saloons are really only 2-seaters and damn little luggage space. So I got Muller's to make it into a real 2-seater with plenty of boot. Selfish car, I'm afraid. Well, good night and thanks again." The exhaust boomed healthily and back to the wheels spat gravel. The chief range officer watched the ruby lights vanish up King's Avenue towards London Road. He turned on his heel and went to find Corporal Menzies on a search for information that was to prove fruitless. The corporal remained as wooden as the big mahogany box he was in the process of loading into a khaki Land Rover without military symbols. The range officer was a major who tried pulling his rank without success. The Land Rover hammered away in Bond's wake. The major walked moodily off to the offices of the National Rifle Association to try and find out what he wanted in the library under Bond J. James Bond's appointment was not with a girl. It was with a BEA flight to Hangover and Berlin. And he bit on the miles to London Airport, pushing the car so hard as to have plenty of time for a drink. 3 drinks before the takeoff, only part of his mind was on the road. The rest was re-examining from the umpteenth time the sequence that was now leading him to an appointment with an aeroplane, but only an interim appointment. His final rendezvous, one of the next 3 nights in Berlin, was with a man. He had to see this man and infallibly shoot him dead. When about 2:30 that afternoon, James Bond had gone through the double-padded doors and he had sat down opposite the turned-away profile on the other side of M's desk, he had sensed trouble. There was no greeting. M was sunk into his stiff-turned collar in a Cumberland pose of gloomy reflection, and there was a droop of bitterness at the corners of his lips. He swiveled his chair round to face Bond, gave him a praising glance as if Bond thought to see that his tie was straight and his hair properly brushed, and then he began speaking fast, clipping off his sentences as he wanted to be rid of what he was saying, and of Bond as quickly as possible. "Number 272. He's a good man. You won't have come across him. Simple reason. He's been holed up in the Nova Zembla since the war. Now he's trying to get out. Loaded with stuff. Atomic and rockets. And they plan for a whole new series of tests from 1961 to put the heat on the West. Something to do with Berlin. Don't quite get the picture, but the FO says if it's true, it's terrific. Makes nonsense of the Geneva Conference and all that blether about nuclear disarmament the Communist bloc are trying to put out. He's got as far as East Berlin, but he's got particularly the whole of the KGB on his tail, and the East German security forces, of course. He's holed up somewhere in the city and he's got one message over to us, that he'll be coming across between 6 and 7 p.m. on one of the next 3 nights. Tomorrow, next day, and the day after. He gave the crossing point. Trouble is, the downward curve of M's lips became even more bitter. The courier he used was a double. Station WB bowled him out yesterday, quite by chance. Had a lucky break with one of the KGB codes. The courier will be flown out for trial, of course, but that won't help. The KGB know that 272 will be making a run for it. They know when, they know where. They know just as much as we do and no more. Now the code we cracked was a 1-day only setting on their machines, but we got the whole of that day's traffic, and that was good enough. They plan to shoot him on the run, at this street crossing between East and West Berlin, he gave in his message. They're mounting quite an operation, Operation Extance, they call it. Put the best sniper on the job. All we know about him is his code name is the Russian for Tiger. Station WB guesses he's the same man they used for a sniper work, long-range stuff across his frontier. They're going to be guarding this crossing every night, and his job is to get 272. Of course, they obviously prefer to do a smoother job with machine guns and what have you, but it's quiet in Berlin at the moment, and apparently the word is it's got to say so. Anyway, M shrugged. They've got confidence in this Tiger operator, and that's the way it's going to be. Where do I come in, sir? James Bond had guessed the answer. Guessed why M was showing his dislike of the whole business. This was going to be dirty work, and Bond, because he belonged to the 00 section, had been chosen for it. Previously, Bond wanted to force M to put it in black and white. This was going to be bad news, dirty news, and he didn't want to hear it from one of the section officers or even from the chief of staff. This was to be murder, all right. Let M bloody well say so. Where do you come in, 007? M looked coldly across his desk. You know where you come in. You've got to kill this sniper, and you've got to kill him before he gets 272. That's all. That's understood? The clear blue eyes remained as cold as ice. Bond knew that they remained so only with an effort of will. M didn't like sending any man to be a killing, but when it had to be done, he always put on the fierce, cold act of command. Bond knew why. It was to take some of the pressure, some of the guilt off the killer's shoulders. So now Bond knew these things, decided to make it easy and quick for M. He got to his feet. "That's all right, sir. I suppose the Chief of Staff has got all the gen. I'd better go and put in some practice. I wouldn't want to miss." He walked to the door. M said quietly, "Sorry to have to hand this to you. Nasty job, but it's got to be done well." "I'll do my best, sir." James Bond walked out and closed the door behind him. He didn't like the job, but on the whole he'd rather have it himself than have the responsibility of ordering someone else to go and do it. The Chief of Staff had been only a shade more sympathetic. "Sorry you bought this one, James," he had said, but Trancre was definite. He hadn't got anyone good enough on his section, and this isn't the sort of job you can ask a regular soldier to do. Plenty of top marksmen in the bar, but a live target needs another kind of nerve. Anyway, I've been to Bingsley and fixed a shoot for you tonight, 8:15 when the range will be closed. Visibility should be about the same as you'll be getting in Berlin, and around an hour earlier. The armourer had got the gun. A real target job, and he's sending it down with one of his men. You'll find on your way. Then, you booked on a midnight BEA charter flight to Berlin. Take a taxi to this address." He handed Bond a piece of paper. "Go up to the 4th floor and you'll find Trancre's number 2 waiting for you. Then, I'm afraid you'll just have to sit out the next 3 days." "How about the gun? Am I supposed to take it through gear customs in a golf bag or something?" The Chief of Staff hadn't been used. "It'll go over in the FO bag. You'll have it by tomorrow midday." He had reached for a signal pad. "Well, you better get cracking. I'll just let Trancre know everything's fixed." James Bond glanced down at the dim blue face of the dashboard clock. 10:15. With any luck, by this time tomorrow, it will all be finished. After all, it was the life of this man Trigger against the life of 272. It wasn't exactly murder. Pretty near it, though. He gave a vicious blast on his triple wind horns at an offensive family saloon, took the roundabout in a quite unnecessary dry skid, wrenched the wheel harshly to correct it, and pointed the nose of the Bentley towards the distant glow that was London Airport. The ugly 6-storey building at the corner of the Kostas at the Wilhelmsphere was the only one standing in a waste of empty bomb space. Bond paid off his taxi and got a brief impression of the waist-high weeds and the half-tilled rubble wall stretched away to the big deserted crossroads, lit by a central cluster of yellowish arc lamps. Before he pushed the bell for the 4th floor at once, he heard the click over the door opener. The door closed itself behind him, and he walked over the uncarpeted cement floor to the old-fashioned lift. The smell of cabbage, cheap cigar smoke, and stale sweet reminded him of another apartment houses in Germany and Central Europe. Even the sigh and the faint squeal of the slow lift were part of the 100 assignments when he had been fired off by M like a projectile at some distant target, where a problem waited for this coming. Waiting to be solved by him. At least this time the reception committee was on his side. This time there was nothing to fear at the top of the stairs. Number 2 of the Secret Service Station WB was a lean, tense man in his early 40s. He wore the uniform of his profession. Well cut, well used, lightweight tweeds and a dark green herringbone and a soft white silk shirt and an old school tie. In the case of Wakermist, at the sight of the tie, and while they exchanged conventional greetings in the small, musty lobby of the apartment, Bond's spirits already lowered sank to another degree. He knew the type, backbone of the civil service, overcharmed and underloved at Winchester, a good second in PPE at Oxford, the war staff jobs he would have done, meticulously perhaps, a QBE, Allied Control Commission in Germany where he had been recruited into the I branch, and hence, because he was the ideal staff man at A.1, with security, and because he thought he would find life, drama, romance, the things he had never had into the Secret Service. A sober, careful man who had been needed to chaperone Bond on this ugly business. Captain Paul Sender, late of the Welsh Guards, had been the obvious choice. He had brought it, now, like a good Westminster. He concealed his distaste for the job beneath the careful, trite conversation that showed Bond the layout of the apartment and the arrangements that had been made for the execution. pre-prepared and, to the modest extent, his comfort. The flat consisted of a large double bedroom, a bathroom and a kitchen containing tinned food, milk, butter, eggs, tea, bacon, bread and one bottle of Dimple Hague. And the only odd feature in the bedroom was that one of the double beds was angled up against the curtains, covering the single board window, and was piled high with 3 mattresses below the bedcloths. Captain Sender said, "Care to have a look at the field of fire? Then I can explain where the other side have in mind." Bond was tired. He didn't particularly want to go sleep with the picture of the Bassfield on his mind, he said. That would be fine. Captain Sender switched off the lights. Chinks from the street light at the intersection showed round the curtains. "Didn't want to draw these curtains," said Captain Sender, "but they've been on the lookout for a covering party for 272. If you just lie on the bed and get your head under the curtains, I'll brief you about what you'll be looking at. Look to the left." It was a sash window and the bottom half was open. The mattress by design gave only a little, and James Bond found himself more or less in the firing position he had been on in the sentry range, but now staring across broken, thickly weeded bombed ground towards the bright river of Zementris, the border with East Berlin. It looked about 150 yards away. Captain Sender's voice from above him and behind the curtain began reacting. It reminded Bond of a spiritualist seance. "That's bombed ground in front of you. Plenty of cover, 130 yards of it up the frontier. Then the frontier, the street, and then a big stretch more bombed ground on the enemy side. That's why 272 chose this route. It's one of the few places in the town which is broken land, thick weeds, ruined walls, cellars on both sides of the frontier. He'll sneak through that mess on the other side and make a dash across the Zimmerstrie for the mass on our side. Trouble is, we'll have 30 yards of brightly lit frontier to sprint across. That will be the killing ground, right?" Bond said, "Yes." He said it softly with the scent of the enemy, needing to take care already that he had him by the nerves. "To your left, that's a big new 10-story block of the Haus der Mistrisen, the chief brain centre of East Berlin. You can see the lights are still on in most of the windows. Most of those stay all night. Those chaps work hard, shifts all round the clock. You probably wouldn't need to worry about the lightened ones. The trigger chap will almost certainly fire from one of these dark windows. You'll see these a block of 4 together on the corner above the intersection. They've stayed dark last night and tonight. They've got the best field of fire. From here, their range varies from 300 to 310 yards. I've got all the figures and so on when you want them. You needn't worry much about anything else. That street stays empty during the night. Only the motorised patrols about every half an hour or so. Lightly armoured car with a couple of motorcycles as escort. Last night, which I suppose is typical, between 6 and 7, when this thing was going to be done, there were a few people that came and went out of that side door, civil servant types. Before that, nothing out of the ordinary. Usual flow of people in and out of a busy government building, except of all things a whole damned women's orchestra. Made the hell of a racket in some concert hall they've got in there. Part of the block is the Ministry of Culture. Otherwise, nothing. Certainly none of the KGB people we know, nor any signs of their preparation for a job like this. But there wouldn't be. They're careful chaps, the opposition. Anyway, have a good look. Don't forget, it's darker than it will be tomorrow around 6, but you can get the general picture. Bond got the general picture, and it stayed with him long after the other man was asleep and snoring softly with a gentle, regular clicking sound. A weakness snore, Bond reflected irritably. Yes, he had got the picture. The picture of a flicker of movement among the shadowy ruins on the other side of the gleaming river of light. A pause. The wild zigzagging sprint of a man in full glare of the arcs. The crash of gunfire, and either a crumpled sprawling heap in the middle of the wide street, or the noise of his onward dash through the weeds and rubble of the western sector. Sudden death or home run. The true gauntlet. How much time would Bond have to spot the Russian sniper in one of those dark windows and kill him? 5 seconds? 10? When dawn edged the curtains with gun metal, Bond capitalised to this fleeting mind. It had won. He went softly into the bathroom and surveyed the ranks of medicine bottles that a thoughtful Secret Service had provided to keep its executioner in good shape. He selected the Turinol, chased down 2 of the ruby and blue depth charges with a glass of water, and went back to bed. Then, poleaxed, he slept. He awoke at midday. The flat was empty. Bond drew the curtains to let in the grey Prussian day, and standing well back from the window, gazed out into the drabness of Berlin, and listened to the tram noises and to the distant screeching of the U-Bahn. As it took a big curve into the Zoo station, he gave a quick reluctant glance at what he had examined the night before, noted that the weeds among the bomb rubble were much the same as the London ones, rosebay, willow herb, dock and bracken, and then went into the kitchen. There was a note propped against the loaf of bread. "My friend," a Secret Serviceman emphasised, which is the context meaning sender's chief, "says it's all right for you to go out. Be back by 1700 hours. Your gear, double torque for Bond's rifle, had arrived at the Batam and will lay it out by this PM. Sender." Bond lit the gas cooker, burned the message with a sneer at his profession, and then brewed himself a vast dish of scrambled eggs and bacon, which he heaped on buttered toast and washed down with black coffee, into which he had poured a liberal tot of whisky. Then he bathed and shaved, dressed in the drab, anonymous Middle European clothes he had ever brought over for the purpose, looked at the disordered bed, decided to hell with it, and went down into the lift and out of the building. James Bond had always found Berlin a glum, inethereal city, vanished off the western side with a brittle veneer of gimcrack polish, rather like the chromium trim of an American motor cars. He walked to the kerfuffle stand, sat in the Café Marquette, drank an espresso, and moodily watched the obedient queues of pedestrians waiting for the go sign on the traffic lights, while the shiny stream of cars went through their dangerous quadrille and busy intersection. It was cold outside, and the sharp wind from the Russian steppes whipped at the girls' skirts and at the waterproofs of the impatient, hurrying men, each with an inevitable briefcase tucked under his arm. The infrared wall heaters in the cafe glared redly down and gave a suspicious glow to the faces of the cafe squatters, consuming their traditional 1 cup of coffee and 10 glasses of water, reading the free newspapers and periodicals in their wooden racks, and earnestly bent over business documents. Bond, closing his mind to the evening, debated with himself about ways to spend the afternoon. It finally came down to a choice between a visit to that respectable-looking brownstone house in the Kaufhauswitz, known to all congressmen and taxi drivers, or a trip to 1C and a tremendous walk into the Grillwald. Virtue triumphed. Bond paid for his coffee, went out into the cold, and took a taxi to the Zoo station. The pretty young trees around the long lake had already been touched by the breath of autumn, and there was occasional gold amongst the green. Bond walked hard for 2 hours along the leafy paths, then chose a restaurant with a glistened veranda above the lake, and greatly enjoyed a high tea consisting of a double portion of Mahatis, herring smothered in cream and onion rings, and 2 Molly-Mitt corn, the Berlin equivalent of a boiler-maker, and his assistant Schnaps, doubles washed down with draught Lombaro. Then, feeling more encouraged, he took the S-Bahn back into the city. Outside the apartment house, a nondescript young man was tinkering with an engine of a black Opel Catan. He didn't take this head out of under the bonnet when Bond passed close by, and went up to the door and pressed the bell. Captain Sender was reassuring. It was a friend, a corporal from the transport section of Station WB. He had fixed up some bad engine trouble on the Opel. Each night from 6 to 7, he would be ready to produce a series of multiple backfires when a signal on a walkie-talkie operated by Sender told him to do so. This would give some kind of cover for the noise of Bond's shooting. Otherwise, the neighbourhood might alert the police, and there would be a lot of untidy explaining to be done. Their hideout was in the American sector, and while their American friends had given Station WB clearance for this operation, the friends were naturally anxious that it should be a clean job and without repercussions. Bond was suitably impressed by the car gimmick, and he was by the very workman-like preparations that had been made for him in the living room. Here, behind the head of his high bed, giving a perfect firing position, a wood and metal stand had been erected against the broad windowsill, and along it lay the Winchester, the tip of the barrel just denting the curtains. The wood and all the metal parts of the rifle and the sniper scope had been painted a dull black and laid out on the bed like sinister evening clothes. Was a black velvet hood stitched to a waist-length shirt of the same material. The hood had wide slits for his eyes and mouth. It reminded Bond of the old prints of the Spanish Inquisition, or of those anonymous operators of the guillotine performing during the French Revolution. There was a similar hood on Captain Saunders' bed, and the section of the window sill there lay a pair of night glasses and a microphone for the walkie-talkie. Captain Sender, his face worried and tense with nerves, said there was no news at the station, no change in the situation, and they knew it. Did Bond want anything to eat, or a cup of tea? Perhaps a tranquilizer? There were several kinds in the bathroom. Bond stitched a cheerful, relaxed expression on his face and said, "No thanks," and gave a light-hearted account of the day with an artery near the solar plexus began thumping gently as tension built up inside him, like a watch spring tightening. Finally, his small talk petered out, and he lay down on the bed with a German thriller that he fought on his wanderings. While Captain Sender moved frequently about the flat, looking too often at his watch and chain-smoking Kent-filled tips, though, he was a careful man, a Dunhill filter holder. James Bond's choice of reading matter, prompted by a spectacular jacket of a half-naked girl strapped to a bed, turned out to have been a very happy one for the occasion. It was called Verbidit Veritran. The prefix "vir" signified that the girl had not only been ruined, damaged, and betrayed, but she had suffered these misfortunes most thoroughly. James Bond temporarily lost himself in the tribulations of the heroine, Gaffin Louise Masturbacha, and it has very iteration that he heard Captain Sender say that it was 5:30 and it's time to take up positions. Bond took off his coat and tie. He picked 2 sticks of chewing gum in his mouth and donned the hood. The lights were switched off by Captain Sender, and Bond lay along the bed. He got his eye to the eyepiece of the sniper scope and gently lifted the bottom edge of the curtain back and over his shoulders. Now, dusk was approaching, but otherwise the scene, a year later to become famous as Checkpoint Charlie, felt like a well-remembered photograph. The wasteland in front of him, the bright river of the frontier road, the farther wasteland, and on the left the ugly square block of the Hans de Ministrien. With its lit and dark windows, Bond scanned it all slowly, moving the sniper scope with the rifle by means of the precision screws on the wooden base. It was all the same, except that now there was a trickle of personnel leaving and entering the ministry through the door onto the Wittelsbahn. Bond looked along at the 4 dark windows. Dark again tonight. Then he agreed with Sender where the enemy's firing points. The curtains were drawn back and the sash windows were wide open at the bottom. Bond's scope could not penetrate into the rooms, but there was no sign of movement within the 4 oblong black gaping mouths. Now there was extra traffic in the street below. The women's orchestra came trooping down the pavement towards the entrance. 20 laughing, talking girls carrying their instruments, a violin with wind instrument cases, satchels with their scores, and 4 of them with the drums, a gay, happy little crocodile. Bond was reflecting that some people still seemed to find life fun in the Soviet sector, when his glasses picked out and stayed on the girl carrying the cello. Bond's jaws stopped still, and then reflectively went on with their chewing and twisted the screw to depress the sniper scope and kept her in his centre. The girl was taller than the others, and her long, straight, fair hair falling to her shoulders shone like molten gold under the arcs at the intersection. She was hurrying along in a charming, excited way, carrying the cello case as if it was no heavier than a violin. Everything was flying, the skirt of her coat, her feet, her hair. She was vivid with movement and life, and it seemed with gravity and happiness as she chattered the 2 girls who flanked her and laughed back at what she was saying. As she turned into the entrance amidst her troop, the arcs momentarily caught a beautiful pale profile, and then she was gone, and it seemed to Bond, with her disappearance, a stab of grief lanced in his heart. How odd. How very odd. This had not happened to him since he was young, and now the single girl, so far away, had caused him to suffer the thin, sharp pang of longing. This thrill of animal magnetism. Morosely, Bond glanced down at the luminous dial of his watch. 5:50. Only 10 minutes to go. No transport arriving at the entrance. None of those anonymous black Zeke salons he had been half expecting. He closed as much of his mind as he could to the girl and sharpened his wits. Get on, damn you. Get back to the job. From somewhere inside the ministry, there came the familiar sounds of an orchestra tuning up, the strings tuning their instruments to a single note on the piano, the sharp blare of an individual woodwinds, then a pause, and then the collective crash of a melody, and the whole orchestra threw itself completely, so far as Bond could judge, into the opening bars of what was, even to James Bond, was vaguely familiar. "The Polovistan Dances by Prince Igor," said Captain Sender succinctly. "Anyway, 6 o'clock coming up." And then, urgently, "Hey, right-hand bottom of the 4 windows. Watch out!" Bond minutely depressed the sniper scope. Yes, there was movement inside the black cave. Now from the interior, a thick black object, a weapon, had slid out. It moved firmly, minutely swivelling down and sideways so as to cover the stretch of the Zimbabweras between the 2 wastelands of rubble. Then, the unseen operator in the room behind seemed satisfied, and the weapon remained still. Fixed obviously to stand as such as Bond had beneath his rifle. "What is it? What sort of gun?" Captain Sender's voice was more breathlessness than it should have been. "Take it easy, damn it," thought Bond. "It's me who's supposed to have the nerves." He strained his eyes, taking in the squat flesh eliminator at the muzzle, the telescopic sight and thick downward chunk of the magazine. Yes, that would be it, absolutely for sure, and the best they had. "Kalashnikov," he said currently. "Submachine gun, gas operated, 30 rounds in 7.62mm. Favourite of the KGB. They're going to do a saturation job after all. Perfect for the range. We'll have to get him quickly or 272 will end up not just dead but strawberry jam. You keep an eye out for any movement over there in the rubble. I'll have to stay married to that window and the gun. We'll have to show himself to fire. Other chaps are probably spotting behind him, perhaps from all 4 windows. Much the sort of setup we expected, but I didn't think they would use a weapon that was going to make all that racket, like this one will. Should have known they would. A running man would be hard to get in this light with a single-shot job." Bond fiddled minutely with the transversing and elevating screws at his fingertips and got to the fine lines of the scope exactly intersected just behind where the butt of the enemy gun merged into the blackness behind. Get to the chest and didn't bother about the head. Inside the hood, Bond's face began to sweat and his eye socket was slippery against the rubber of the eyepiece. But that didn't matter. It was only his hands, his trigger finger, that must stay bone dry. As the minutes ticked by, he frequently blinked his eyes to rest them, shifted his limbs to keep them supple, listened to the music to relax his mind. The minutes slothed on leaden feet. How old would she be? Early 20s? Say 23? With that poise and innocence, the hint of authority in her long east stride, she would come from good racy stock, and one of the old Prussian families probably, or from similar remnants in Poland or even Russia. Why in hell did she have to choose the cello? There was something almost indecent in the idea of that bulbous, ungainly instrument between her splayed thighs. Of course, Sogria had managed to look elegant, and so did that girl, Amaryllis somebody. But they shouldn't invert a way for a woman to play the damn thing side saddle. At his side, Captain Sender said 7 o'clock. Nothing stirred on the other side. Bit of movement on our side near a cellar close to the frontier, but that's all reception committee. 2 good men from the station. Better stay with it until they close down. Let me know when they take that gun in. All right? It was 7:30 when the KGB's submachine gun was gently drawn back into the black interior. One by one, bottom slashes of the 4 windows were closed. Cold-hearted game was over for the night. 272 was still holed up. 2 more nights to go. Bond softly drew the curtain over his shoulders and across the muzzle of the Winchester. He got up and pulled off his cowl and went into the bathroom and stripped and had a shower. Then the 2 large whiskies on the rocks in quick succession. While he waited, his ears pricked for now muffled sound of the orchestra to stop. When at 8 o'clock it did, with the expert comment from Sender, "Brodmann's Prince Igor choral dance number 17, I think." He said to Sender, who had been guessing off this report in the garbled language to the head of station. "Just going to have another look. I'd rather take him to that tall blonde with the cello." "Didn't notice her," said Sender, uninterested. He went into the kitchen. "Tea?" guessed Bond. "Or perhaps Holricks?" Bond donned his cowl, went back to the firing position, and depressed the sniper scope to the doorway of the ministry. Yes, they went, not so gay and laughing now, tired perhaps. And now, here she came, less lively, but still with a beautiful, careless stride. Bond watched the blown golden hair and the fawn raincoat until it had vanished into the indigo dusk of the Wiltshire Sea. Where did she live? In some miserable flanked room in the suburbs? Or in one of the privileged apartments in the hideous lavatory titled Steyleen? Bond drew himself back somewhere within easy reach. That girl lived. Was she married? Did she have a lover? Anyway, to hell with it. She's not for him. The next day and the next night watch were duplicates, with small variations of the first. James Bond had 2 brief rendezvous by sniper scope with the girl, and the rest was a killing of time and a tightening of the tension that, by the time the third and final day came, was like a fog in the small room. James Bond crammed the third day with an almost lunatic programme of museums, art galleries, the zoo and a film, hardly perceiving anything he looked at. His mind's eye divided between the girl and those 4 black squares, and the black tube and the unknown man behind it, the man he was now certainly going to kill tonight. The next day and the next night watch were duplicates, with small variations of the first. James Bond had 2 more brief rendezvous by sniper scope with the girl, and the rest was a killing of time and a tightening of the tension that by the time the third and final day came was like a fog in the small room. James Bond crammed the third day with an almost lunatic programme of museums, art galleries, the zoo and a film, hardly perceiving anything he looked at, his mind's eye divided between the girl and those 4 black squares, and the black tube and the unknown man behind it, the man he was now certainly going to kill tonight. Back at the apartment punctually at 5, Bond narrowly averted a row with Captain Sender because he had poured himself a stiff whiskey before putting on the hideous cowl that now stank of his sweat. Captain Sender had tried to prevent him. When he failed, he threatened to call up the head of section and report Bond for breaking training. "Look, my friend," said Bond wearily, "I've got to commit murder tonight, not you. So be a good chap and stuff it, would you? You can tell Tranquil anything you like when it's over. Think I like this job, having a 00 number and so on? I'd be quite happy for you to get me sacked from the 00 section. Then I could settle down and make a snug nest of papers as an ordinary staffer, right?" Bond drank down his whiskey, reached for his thriller, narrowly arriving at an appalling climax, and threw himself on the bed. Captain Sender, icily silent, went off into the kitchen to brew from the sounds of his inevitable cuppa. Bond felt the whiskey beginning to melt the coiled nerves in his stomach. Now then, little Letty, how in the hell are you going to get out of this fix? It was exactly 6:05 when Sender at his post began talking excitedly. "Bond, there's something moving way back over there." Now he stopped. "Wait, no, he's on the move again, keeping low. There's a bit of a broken wall there. He'll be out of sight of the opposition. But thick weeds, yards of them, ahead of them. Christ, he's coming through the weeds and they're moving. Hope to God they think it's only the wind. Now he's through and gone to ground. Any reaction?" "No," said Bond sententiously. "Keep on telling me. How far to the frontier?" "He's only got about 50 yards to go." Captain Sender's voice was harsh with excitement. "Broken stuff, but some of it's open. Then a solid chunk of wall right up against the pavement. He'll have to get over it. They can't fail to spot him then. Now he's made 10 yards, another 10. Got him, clearly." James Bond felt the sweat pouring down his face and neck. He took a chance and quickly wiped his hands down his sides and then got them back on the rifle, his finger inside the guard, just lying along the curved trigger. "There's something moving in the room behind the gun. They must have spotted him. Get that Opel working." Bond heard the code word into the microphone, heard the Opel in the street below start up, felt his pulse quicken as the engine leaped into life, and a series of ear-splitting cracks came from the exhaust. The movement in the black cave was now definite. A black arm with a black dub had reached out and under the stock. "Now!" he ejaculated, Captain Sender. "Now! He's run for the wall. He's up it. He's going to jump." And then, in the sniper scope, Bond saw the head of Trigger. The purity of the profile, the golden bell of hair, all laid out along the stock of the Kalashnikov. She was dead. A sitting duck. Bond's fingers flashed down to the screws, inched them around as the yellow flame fluttered at the snout of the submachine gun, squeezed the trigger. The bullet, dead on 310 yards, must have hit where the stock ended up the barrel, might have got her in the left hand, but the effect was to tear the gun off its mountings, smash it against the side of the window frame, and then hurl it out of the window. It turned several times on its way down and crashed into the middle of the street. "He's over!" Captain Sender shouted. "He's over! He's done it! My God, he's done it!" "Get down!" Bond said sharply, and threw himself sideways off the bed as the big eye of a searchlight in one of the black windows blazed on, serving up the street towards their block and their room. The gunfire crashed and the bullets howled into the window, ripping the curtains, smashing the woodwork, thudding into the walls. Beyond the roar and the zing of bullets, Bond heard the Appel race off down the street and behind them again, the fragmentary whisper of the orchestra. Of course. The orchestra had probably raised an infernal disfort of Hans de Messier, having been used like the backfiring of the Appel on this side, to provide some sort of cover for the sharp burst of fire on their side by Trigger. Had she carried her weapon to and from every day in that cello case? Was the whole orchestra composed of KGB women? Had the other instrument cases contained only equipment, the big drum perhaps, the searchlight, while the real instruments were available in the concert hall? Too elaborate? Too fantastic? Probably. But there had been no doubt about the girl in the sniper scope. Bond had only ever been able to see one wide, heavily lashed aiming eye. Had he hurt her? Almost certainly her left arm. There would be no chance of seeing her, seeing how she was if she had left the orchestra. Now he would never see her again. Their window would be a death trap. To underline the fact, a stray bullet smashed into the mechanism of the Winchester, already overturned and damaged, and hot lead splashed down on Bond's hands, burning the skin. On Bond's empathetic oath, abruptly, the firing stopped and silence sang in the room. Captain Sender emerged from beside his bed, brushing glass out of his hair. They crunched across the floor and through the splintered door into the kitchen. Here, because it faced away from the street, it was safe to switch on the light. "Any damage?" asked Bond. "No. You all right?" Captain Sender's pale eyes were bright with the fever that comes in battle. They also, Bond noticed, held a sharp glint of accusation. "Yes. Just get an elastoplast from my hand. Caught a splash from one of the bullets." Bond went into the bathroom. When he came out, Captain Sender was sitting by the walkie-talkie he had fetched from the sitting room. He was speaking into it. "Now," he said in the microphone, "that's all for now. Fine. About 272. Hurry, the armoured car, if you would. Be glad to get out of here, and 007 will need to write this version of what happened, okay? Then over and out." Captain Sender turned to Bond, half accusing, half embarrassed. He said, "Afraid Heather Section needs your reasons in writing for not getting the chap. I had to tell him I see you alter your aim at the last second. Gave Trigger time to get off the burst. Damn lucky for 272, he had just begun his sprint. Blew chunks out of the wall behind him. What was all that about?" James Bond knew he could lie, knew he could fake a dozen reasons why. Instead, he took a deep pull at a strong whiskey he had poured for himself, put the glass down and looked at Captain Sender straight in the eye. Trigger was a woman. So what? KGB has got plenty of women agents and women gunners. I'm not at all least surprised. Russian women's teams always do well in world championships. Last meeting in Moscow, they came first, second and third against 7 countries. I can even remember 2 of their names, Doyaska and Lomanova. Terrific shots. She may even have been one of them. What does she look like? Records will probably be able to turn her up. She was a blonde. She was the girl who carried the cello in that orchestra. Probably had the gun in the cello case. The orchestra was to cover up their shooting. "Oh," said Captain Sender slowly. "I see. The girl you've been keen on. That's right. Well, I'm sorry, but I have to put that in my report too. You had clear orders to exterminate Trigger." There came the sound of the car approaching. It pulled off somewhere below. The bell rang twice. Captain Sender said, "Well, let's get going. They've sent an armoured car to get us out of here." He paused. His eyes flickered over Bond's shoulders, avoiding Bond's eyes. "Sorry about the report. Got to do my duty, you know. You should have killed that sniper, whoever it was." Bond got up. He said he didn't want to leave the stinking little smashed-up flat, leaving the place from which for 3 days he had had his long-range, one-sided romance with an unknown girl. An unknown enemy agent with much the same job in her outfit as he had in his. Poor little bitch. She would be in worse trouble now than he was. She'd certainly be court-martialed for muffling the job. Probably kicked out of the KGB, he shrugged. At least they stopped short of killing her, and he himself had done. James Bond said wearily, "Okay, with any luck it'll cost me my 00 number. but tell the head of section not to worry. The girl won't do any more snipering. Probably lost her left hand. Certainly broke her nerve with this kind of work. Scared the living daylights out of her, in my book. That was enough. Let's go. You just heard the